I want to greet all of you who I may be coming into the lives of various people in your learning journey. Um, the present context, I think, demands of me to say that these are very special days, and I'm glad to be able to share some thoughts with you in a time when we are all revisiting our faith, when we're beginning to wonder who we are and why we are here, when we are dealing with questions of what is self-sufficiency in a world that is so much in pain, struggling. So we're challenged in these days. Our economic systems obviously are vulnerable. Our nation states are not coordinated in responding to pandemics. And our democracies are built on systems that are not very sensitive to the needs of the world. So I come to you with a concern in my own life about what I see happening around us and the great fear that exists in many of our homes in these days. I also want to say that I think technology is wonderful, but it isn't me. I struggle with technology, and I don't want to be a talking head, but apparently that's my limitation in the area of technology. We should be able to be in dialogue and in conversation. I would much rather be sitting in a circle with all of you and being able to respond to each other as we learn. But this is an attempt to give you some process for learning in the present context. And I want to share with you in a few minutes the philosophy I've come to understand that I call the circle of life philosophy. And it's primarily a Cree philosophy, but I will say that I've learned from Anishinaabe elders. I've attended ceremonies led by Lakota elders, and I've sat in many circles beyond my own community experience that have taught me. My understanding of the Cree medicine wheel is that it's developing, and the materials that were sent to you for study that deal with the medicine wheel don't really hold up all of the understandings that I have been given. But of course, then I would tell you that I don't think there is a Cree philosophy or a Cree teaching or a Cree spirituality that is sort of doctrinally pure. We are people on a journey. We are cultures that are developing with our many contacts, our many contexts. And so the medicine wheel is an attempt to provide an organization of thought, a paradigm for understanding human development. And the uniqueness about indigenous philosophies, I think, is that generally we're connected to the creation. Our understanding is an ecological understanding. So the basis of indigenous wisdom, the way of knowing, the way of striving, is generally for a holistic approach to seeing ourselves in a world that is very diverse and has many things to offer us that we can learn from. So I sit beside the creek here in Petersfield as it opens up and the geese have returned. And in our understanding, the geese teach us how to be family, how to make commitment, and how to care for our young. So it isn't as though human beings have the answers. We can learn always from watching what is around us. I think that's maybe central to the philosophy of life that I've come to learn about in my journey. So there's a balance that is sought after in developing knowledge, acknowledging our connection to all of creation. We say in Cree, "Kakinaw and Wako Maganak." That means all my relations. And that is an important lesson for us as Indigenous, I think a lesson for all peoples, because it acknowledges we are connected to the wholeness of creation. And we develop and grow as people within that reality. The medicine wheel, then, the article said, is a pathway to healing. It's a quote from the article, and I think that's very true, because the medicine wheel is about reclaiming identity and purpose. It's about gathering traditional knowledge in a pattern that is usable, understandable, and transferable. It can be given to younger people, can be given to our colleagues in our communities as a way of understanding each other. But central, I would say again, the thing that's missing from much of what I've experienced in the church is that traditional knowledge is centered on the idea that we are connected to all of life, to the wholeness of creation. Holistic circular thinking. So the medicine wheel is about thought that is circular. It's not about arriving at answers or simple solutions. It's about being engaged in life as we move through it. So scientific thought often, I think, is developed in our modern world in linear thought, linear patterns, trying to dissect information, gain information from taking things apart, from finding the pieces of truth. Our experience in Indigenous territory historically would be that we would experience life and we'd then ponder it, probably take time to be in ceremony about it, to dream about it, to let it sit for a time. So the idea of arriving at a solution or a comprehension of some realities really is an ongoing process. And all of us are in that process of learning and journeying through life. So linear thinking, I think, is fragmented, often leaves us with a lot of information all around us that isn't brought together as any kind of holistic process of knowing who we are and with whom we share life. So when I went to university, I still remember thinking, isn't it strange that people study chemistry and English and geography and never really take time to comprehend what all of these things have in relation to each other? All patterns of specialization, hoping to gain knowledge that then is a fragment of what life is about. So I think this is a challenge for us within, as Indigenous, within a system in society that is called education, that is really about transferring pieces of information, linear thought, that we have to process and connect for ourselves with our life, but never really being assisted in understanding who we are and why we're doing what we're doing. So I've learned from the elders that we don't have to protect knowledge. I noticed in the article that was forwarded that there was some fear that what we know might be taken. So the idea of thought, of knowledge being owned is a very strange concept. I don't believe it to be Cree. I don't believe it to be Indigenous. I don't believe it to be faithful. I think the idea of sharing life and being generous with what we dream about, not always fact, not always holistic in our limited understandings, but at least an attempt to understand, is not to be kept to oneself, but much of it is to be shared. Certainly there's private life, there's individual aspects of learning, but much of life is about sharing life and coming to know each other, trusting each other. So I don't believe in protecting knowledge. I don't think that's the circle of life I would promote. I don't believe that the elders would tell us not to share what we dream about, what we think about. So balance in life is a learning about being in community as individuals. So we don't deny ourselves. We don't deny who we are individually, but our primary focus is to find how we as individuals fit into the community and are part of the circle of life. So we've experienced colonization, and colonization has been very, very injurious to Indigenous peoples globally. But I know of the experience in the context in which we live on Turtle Island. The idea of colonization has been impactful in that no one ever wanted to steal our knowledge because they didn't think we had any, right? So people discounted Indigenous ideas and thought because the belief from the very beginning, not only among missionaries, but among settler peoples generally, was that we were less than human, a very common thought initially, that the lands on which we lived were not being used adequately, that all the resources on the land belonged to someone else, and we had no right to the wealth of the land. So colonization has created a whole generation of us, Indigenous peoples, now many generations of us, who are dependent. So I want to talk about the circle of life. And I know in the diagram in the article that you have been reading, there's a circle of life, but I'm going to tell you that it's wrong. No, it's not wrong. It's not wrong. It's just, it's different than what I know. So the difference is that various communities, often neighboring communities, have different colors for the different directions in the circle, in the medicine wheel. So I want to share with you what I have learned about the circle of life, about the medicine wheel, as a part of the teaching around how we understand what stage of life we are in. So I have found this very helpful. I think the first time I heard it was from a Dakota elder. First time I heard it. I later heard it from an Anishinaabe teacher, and I've heard it many times since. I've also experienced the circle of life in the sweat lodge ceremony. So in the sweat lodge, there are 4 doors. There's the eastern door, the southern door, the western door, and the northern door. And these 4 doorways are the foundation of our spiritual understanding of life. The number 4 is very special in that it's an inclusive number of all the 4 winds, the 4 directions. And we see ourselves growing in the 4 doorways. So let's start in the eastern doorway. The eastern doorway is the birthing doorway in the teachings I've been given. The birthing doorway is the east. And in that doorway, life begins, birthing. It's the area of spirit. It's the area of life beginning, purity, sacredness. So when a child is born, we say it comes in the eastern door, and that doorway is the doorway that brings us new life. And that child is born, and that child is totally dependent. That child will only survive if it's given protection, food, love, and is cared for in every way. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, that life is nurtured. So we begin life, all of us, in the eastern door. We begin life dependent. So the key word is dependent. Dependent on community. That's how we start our lives, and that's the beginning. And very early on, a child learns that that's a good place. A young child that is cared for well, that is fed, that is loved, will soon respond to all the people around them with joy, with comfort, and will become a part of the community very quickly. Will find their place as a valued member of community, as dependent people. Now, moving in the circle of life clockwise, you can imagine moving from the eastern door to the southern door. As we move to the southern door, It's a journey of life where we begin to speak, and we begin to speak, and we begin to think as little children. We begin to understand that we are a person. We're a human being. And we begin to speak, and most of us know that the first word that a child will speak is no. Because dependence isn't the final destination. In our human spirits, we know that we are moving somewhere else. We're journeying. We're growing physically, mentally, emotionally. We're moving along, and we know the word that we have to learn is that we are a person, that we are saying no to your ideas, no to your presentation of some object that we don't want. We begin to say, I want something else, or I'm a person, so I will do this. And that no is the beginning of the road that takes a number of years towards independence. Independence is a place in our journey of life. And many in society cannot accept this journey. It's difficult for the people who are taking it. Young people who are taking this journey to independence have a lot of difficulties. They have adults who have other ideas about their life. They have friends around them who may have ideas. And so the road to independence is very challenging, but we know we must take it. We work at it. And by the time we're teenagers, the independence is pretty well established in our lives. We're making many decisions about ourselves, about how we'll use our time, how we're going to learn, how we're going to be involved in various activities, and we're making those decisions based on our independence. And independence is a goal, and I think it's worthwhile. In Indigenous communities historically, it was called the wandering time. And it was allowed for in the development of the human. The elders understood, the parents began to understand with some difficulty that wandering and rejection and aggression on the part of young people in finding themselves was acceptable. But the elders always told the community that this was a time that had to be cared for, that people could wander, but there must be some teachings, there must be some guidance, and this growing in independence must be nurtured, must be a part of the human's experience. So there we go, we move to independence, and our society is still doing it. My concern as an Indigenous person is that's where we usually stop. Much in our society is believed to end with independence. Most of our financial systems, our life teachings in the school systems, our understanding of life values is that we arrive at independence, and that's where we find ourselves. End of story. But the Cree teaching is, the Indigenous teaching is, that life goes on. And the moving to adulthood, from independence to adulthood, involves hard work. People who are parenting, people who are working, people who are caring for others in society, people who are now working in places like the healthcare field, working in grocery stores, working in public places, who are putting themselves at risk. These are people who are moving beyond independence. They're modeling for us in this society what it means to be interdependent. And that's really what I wanted to share with you, is that we move beyond selfishness from independence to interdependence, and that adulthood is a stage of understanding, of growing. And as parents in the historic, traditional Indigenous communities, parents basically cared for everyone in the circle of life. The people who were working, the hunting-gatherers, the people who cooked, the people who prepared foods and so on, prepared shelter. These people are the ones who modeled interdependence. They cared for the elderly, they cared for the infants, they cared for the troublesome youth, they cared for everyone because they were in a responsible role. So interdependence is, I think, what we strive for. I should go back and say each doorway has an animal, because in our teachings to our peoples, in our ceremonies, we say the eagle is at the eastern doorway. And the eagle brings the teaching of love. And the eastern doorway then is the love doorway. It brings the teaching of love and vision. So the eagle's there. The southern doorway, the animal at the doorway is the wolf. And the wolf is the teacher of humility. And on the road to independence, that's the most difficult lesson. You see, it's contrary to the vision of self-worth and selfishness. The teaching of humility brings us to a place of slowly understanding there's more to life than me. There's more to life than self. There's more to life than we have experienced so far. We're beginning to wonder about what it means to be in relationship. So the wolf is at the doorway, and the wolf teaching is, I know nothing, and I understand even less. I know nothing. And if a young person can arrive at that point of humility, of real humility, I think then they're prepared to move on to interdependence. The western doorway, the animal that I've been taught is at the western door, is the bear. The mother bear is the prime example of a protective adult, the caring mother, the one who would give their life for those they are caring for, especially for the little ones. So the bear is in the western doorway, and as we learn interdependence, we have teachings from the bear that we carry with us. The northern doorway is the bison. The bison. And it's the residence of those who have lived life, or elders in the northern door, who keep the stories, keep the teachings and the ceremonies, and tell the people when things need to change. Tell the people when there are new dreams. Tell the people how to be community in a good way, in story, not by laying down laws as much as giving example of how to live. So we go through the circle of life clockwise. We are born dependent, and I'm sorry, I live in a home where the phone rings. We'll carry on. I was saying the northern doorway. This is a real live video. This is really live, true to life. The wisdom teachings of the northern doorway, the teachings of the bison, are that we provide support for the interdependence and the health of the community, the honoring of those who are dependent, the respecting of those who are independent, and the assisting of those who are learning interdependence to complete the journey. I have a story that I would like to share with you. When we moved back to our home village in Fisher River in the Cree Reserve some years ago, our youngest daughter was 2, and she was the youngest of 3 children. And she was free spirit. She was just growing out of dependence. She was becoming independent. She was learning to speak, and at that time, as we moved to the community, my grandfather needed a home because he was living alone. My grandmother had died, and he came to live with us. And my grandfather was 82, and our youngest daughter was 2. So they both needed afternoon naps. and they were supposed to have them separately. But we would look into his bedroom in the afternoon, and there they would be having their nap together, which was a good thing. And then in the evening, just before the evening meal, if it was a nice evening, they'd be out in the yard walking together, talking to each other, holding hands and talking. And they were walking at about the same pace, walking together. Rebecca was beginning her life from dependence, moving to independence. My grandfather, who was in his 80s, was moving from being independent, interdependent, to becoming dependent. My grandfather needed food, he needed care and love, support, as he was now becoming weaker physically and less able to care for himself. So here was my grandfather and his great-granddaughter walking together in our yard, taking naps together, learning from each other. I tell you the story in part because I think the completion of the circle of life may be the most difficult part of our learning as we journey, especially in the midst of a pandemic. To realize life is a circle that comes to completion. That may be in Western society the most denied lesson of our society, to acknowledge that death is a part of life and that Rebecca and her great-grandfather walked together, talked together, rested together, visited, and learned from each other. He was learning again how to be dependent, and she was walking the road towards independence and hopefully interdependence. This lesson, this circle of life teaching, I think is what brings us to a holistic place. And I'm just grateful that we can at least consider this in the present context. I think it's timely. This process of journeying through life is based on the circle. And I would say at the very center of the circle, usually in our gatherings, there's a fire, a sacred fire, in the very center of the circle as we gather for ceremonies or we gather for conversation and teachings. There's a fire at the center. For the individual, it is said that there's a fire at the center that is ourself, that we must tend to. The fire at the center of our life is ourself. And we may describe it as our ego or our self-awareness. It's a fire we need to tend. So the circle of life moves clockwise. It has an end, it has a beginning, and they come together. But more than that, we can go backwards in the circle of life. We develop at various paces in life. The idea that we can all fit through a school system that begins at kindergarten or nursery, and we move along linear pattern to a school system is madness, because we're individuals. We expect people to proceed in their learning at a certain pace. And we program it that within 12 years, you'll be finished with your sort of schooling patterns and move on to other things. But some people don't move at the same pace as others. Individuals get left behind in the learning process that is so linear. So in the circle of life, as I see it, people move at different paces. I had an uncle who was well into his 40s when I knew him as a child, and he hadn't become independent. He was just always doing things that were very childlike. He eventually became a fine family person that knew many things and did many good things. But for a long time, he was lost in what we call the wandering time. So we don't just say that people, when they're 16, are finished with wandering. It may go on for a long time. The pattern of learning how we are in community may take a long period of time. So the circle of life allows us even to return. There are times when I like to go back to being a child in my old age. It's not hard. There are times when Um, I've gone out and made a snow angel. I have a hard time getting up now when I do that, but I still do that. There are times when I do silly things that I know are childlike, and some people may see as madness and foolishness. But I think while the circle moves clockwise, we also move counterclockwise at various points in our life, and that's a good thing. We have to remember our childhood. We have to remember our youth. We have to remember the hard years of working, raising, family, carrying responsibilities as we move into adulthood. And we have to dwell with care as elders in the northern doorway. So I've offered these teachings as a kind of beginning of our conversation. I really would hope at some point we could actually sit together and be in conversation. So if you have questions, I guess one way of handling that would be to bring them back to the center, send them back to the center. There's energy for that. If there are ways that we can interact further, I would welcome that, because I know that you have many, many ideas about the circle of life, and I would love to hear them. Thank you.